Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another one of our suicide prevention webinar series conversations. We have another really good one lined up for you this afternoon. So I want to remind folks, if you've been on some of our talks in the last 2 weeks, you would have found that information on our website, and you can go back to those spaces and also find information if you weren't able to view or be a part of those conversations. We also have another our final webinar coming up later this week, where we're going to be doing a lot of key questions and answers. We're collecting a lot of the questions that have come through the chat box over the last several webinars, and a combination of other questions, and having all those presented at one time. So I would highly encourage you to tune in for that. And you can find that information and registration information again on the Seattle YMCA's website. Today, our conversation is embracing adversity, supporting the development of healthy coping strategies, brought to us by Jerry Blackburn, the Executive Director of Influence the Choice Community Coalition. And for those who have worked with Jerry or Influence the Choice, know how impactful their work has been in the community, and the passion and expertise that they bring. So looking forward to today's conversation and what Jerry is going to share with us, and the information we're going to learn along the way. Also, as a reminder, we'll be doing a Q&A at the very end of today's presentation, so feel free to drop your questions in the chat box throughout the whole presentation. We'll be holding on to those and answering as many of those towards the end of our conversation. As always, these webinars are brought to you by the Sammamish Community YMCA's Advisory Board, as well as the YMCA of Greater Seattle's Social Impact Center. So they've worked really hard to put together the slate of presentations we've had over the last 2 weeks. So with all that said, I'm going to pass it over to Jerry to begin us on this conversation today. And thank you, Jerry, for being here and providing your expertise for us.
There we go. Can everybody hear me? Awesome. Very cool. Thank you, Nate. That was a very gracious introduction. I appreciate that. And thank you, everybody from the Sammamish YMCA and the advisory board for putting together this whole series. September being Suicide Prevention Awareness Month. Super important topic, obviously. Our communities in general have been impacted by suicide and behavioral health struggles in general, specific to anxiety, and so this is a topic that is so vital and important for our community and lots of communities that are struggling. Thank you for Melinda for putting everything together, and Nate and Cato for running everything and making sure it's working. We appreciate that, and we love being able to do anything we can to partner with the Sammamish Y and engage our community. So tonight's topic, oh, I forgot my joke. One of my presentations had went out, the healthy was missing the Y because it wouldn't fit. And so we had a running joke that the YMCA just needed a lot of extra Ys to put in presentation materials and stuff. And so we're actually going to be talking about healthy coping strategies. It was definitely an exercise in patience for me to not have that Y all over the place. I learned a lot about my control issues, so it was pretty funny. So today's conversation is really geared towards thinking about and moving upstream, looking at the other presentations over this month, thinking about our capacity to change our environment to some degree and create an atmosphere and a structure that allow young people to have an increased level of coping skills and strategies to navigate everything that they're encountering is what I do in terms of the coalition work that we engage. And so I get to take some concepts that are really important to the work that we do in terms of mental health promotion and prevention, and put them in front of conversations about maladaptive strategies of coping, and looking at how we can, again, make sure that young people have the skills to engage their environment productively. It's really no surprise that colleges and workplaces are kind of getting caught off guard by the lack of flexibility and malleability in our young people, and you've seen schools make a dramatic switch from highly structured academic embracing that kind of model to incorporating social emotional learning curriculum in everything that we're doing now, and it's very much appreciated for the work that we do. But we want to kind of talk about those things specific to suicide prevention, and again, helping young people find alternatives to potentially unhealthy strategies that they might employ. So one of my favorite characters when I talk about the idea of resilience is Despero. Here he comes. He's stuck. Well, he's stuck on my screen. There he is. If you have never read The Tale of Despero, I highly recommend it. It is one of my all-time favorite books. I recall reading it to my now 15-year-old, and I still would if he would allow me. You know, so many different times, because the story is just so ripe with the concept of resilience. And so if you're not familiar with the show, it's also an awesome movie. If you're not familiar with the book, it's about Despero, who is a very, very tiny mouse, even for mice. And one of the grandest things about Despero is that he has no idea that he is small. In fact, he really thinks he is gigantic in his capacity to do things and be successful and really manage some horrendous events in his life, like being thrown into a dark and hideous dungeon filled with rats and being able to make his way out simply because he thought he could. Again, it's just one of my favorite characters whenever I think about the idea of resilience and what young people need to be successful as young adults and adults in our community. I really start with Despero. He is just fabulous in understanding community and connection and a higher purpose. And we're going to focus on a lot of concepts like that when we look at a model of resilience, helping to understand how we can create internal reward systems for our young people. And so their hearts are always filled and their capacity to understand that they're okay is always ever present. And that's a profound shift. It might seem like it's common, but our young people have been within systems, I believe, a great deal of the time that create a need for external rewards and validations from outside of themselves to feel good about themselves. And so how can we start to change that a little bit? Again, school districts adopting social emotional learning curriculum and looking at whole child health has really been a robust demonstration of that, and we're going to kind of focus on that. The other thing that allows us to do when we think about suicide prevention in terms of kind of the interpersonal psychological theory of suicidal behaviors, the Joiner theory, is how do we dissuade that perceived burdenness where young people don't feel connected, they feel separated from systems and less than in terms of their value. And I think that can be a really important, robust discussion point for us. So first, I wanted to start off with some general considerations. I had the opportunity to be on a webinar just recently as part of the work that we do, Influenza Choice, with CADCA, which is one of the organizations we work with in terms of one of our grants. And we had the opportunity to listen to Dr. Cheryl King from the Youth and Young Adult Depression and Suicide Prevention Research Program. It's out of the University of Michigan's Department of Psychiatry, and I was taken aback. I mean, looking at this information and kind of being steeped in behavioral health, some of the realizations of where we're at as a community kind of struck me off guard. But yeah, let's take a look at some of those. So in our communities, especially for young adults and adolescents, suicide is currently the second leading cause of death, which again caught me off guard. It's very profound. Our communities have been, struck by the loss of life to suicide. Most recently, the Riverview School District had several suicides that they were having to manage as a community, and I worked with some of my friends in the Snoqualmie Valley to see what we could look at in terms of the systems and what might be perpetuating an increase in death by suicide among the adolescent population. So that certainly caught me off guard. Even more striking was the propensity for these suicides, completions, to be involving males a great deal of the time. And I think there's some systemic stuff that we can explore in terms of how young males are treated and the expectations they have in our community specific to how they're supposed to be acting and what they can talk about. But on the other side of that is just lethality of means of suicide attempts. Males have a tendency to choose methods of suicide that are sadly much more productive and end up taking their lives more frequently than females. It's also a very binary representation, unfortunately, in the research. And so I really think it's important for us to look at folks who aren't identifying in those two specific binary gender categories as well. Another thing that caught me off guard was that I think a lot of times we think about the suicidal teen as a very specific individual, like we should be able to pinpoint who that is. And that's really not the case. The overall profile is very, very diverse and complex. It doesn't sit into one category of individuals, although there's some demographics that are more susceptible. But the individual who's experiencing suicidal ideation, thoughts, and ultimately plans and execution is varied in our communities. And so it makes it really difficult. That'll lead into our conversations from the work that we do in terms of risk and protective factors. The beautiful thing about risk and protective factors are that they're universal precautions to some degree, right? They impact a population for a lot of different behaviors, and it reaches a lot of people when we can't target individuals, especially in a circumstance where we don't know necessarily exactly what they might look like. The two populations that are demonstrated most frequently as far as demographics are white individuals and our Native populations. And we'll look at some graphs in a minute or so to kind of outline what that looks like. But I found that very, very interesting as well, is that those two populations were most represented in the data specific to suicide. One of the bits of information that is super germane to the work that we do is thinking about substance use and how it contributes to lethality. Obviously, using substances as a mechanism for an attempt is prevalent, but also is being intoxicated while you're ruminating is obviously going to increase lethality. Substances of abuse, especially things like alcohol, are going to create circumstances where people are unable to access rationale as rapidly. And so obviously it complicates, but it also contributes to, unfortunately, more completions in terms of suicide. So we can think about that in our conversations. And then finally, thinking about, again, increase in addressing protective factors and reducing risk factors is an overall important strategy because the profile is very heterogeneous. We're looking at individuals who are varied in terms of suicidal behaviors. And so how do we impact a very diverse population? It becomes complex. And again, it warrants conversations like these and organizations to kind of engage best practices and start to look at how we can create a dynamic where young people are intervened on. And that's a really important caveat for this whole conversation. Is today in my talk, we're really talking about prevention and systems and altering systemically what young people are experiencing and how they're being created developmentally. This is no substitute for access to appropriate mental health care, super important. And it's important to remember that crisis interventions and all of those structures that are in place for somebody who's experiencing ideation be employed if that's the case, right? This is not a substitute for acute care. So I wanted to just make sure that that caveat was out there as well. So thinking about some of those statistics, we can look at this next slide. Possibly. Here it comes. There we go. Very cool. So this is from the Centers for Disease Control, and this was provided by Dr. King in the webinar that I just recently attended, and I thought it was very telling in terms of our conversations today. But you can see increases in both young adolescent and older adolescents, potentially young adult populations in terms of suicidal behaviors, significant increases in our community, and trying to figure out, okay, so what has changed in our community that's creating this uptick? The important thing to remember, I think, from an overall statistical standpoint, not a loss of life standpoint, is that when we understand concepts like this and we can employ strategies to impact this significantly. When we know about trends and when we know about particular dynamics that might contribute to that, we can really, if we have the resources, create campaigns and strategies to intervene. It really becomes difficult when we're facing bureaucracy and struggles in terms of understanding and accepting suicidal behavior as a reality and things like that. And so these conversations really do serve to support that process as well. The next slide, you'll see, again, some of the demographic trends that I talked about when we look at spikes in adolescent and young adults this is 2018 data. But you'll notice also that for Native American Indian populations, there's a significant increase in young adult populations, and then it decreases over time, and then geriatric issues, obviously. But for white individuals, there's a consistently high frequency of suicidal behaviors increasing as somebody reaches those geriatric ages. And so I think that that's kind of an important demographic to kind of understand and investigate when we look at interventions and how we can change what we're doing in our community systemically. So yeah, so again, some just important caveats to focus our efforts a little bit for today. Yeah, the next slide. Yeah. So the one thing that I wanted to talk about to kind of also structure our conversation about resilience is thinking about our methods of engaging adversity and crisis. And I use this demographic in some of my classes to help my students kind of understand just the basics in terms of crisis responses. And you'll notice in the graphic that all crises are met with some level of disorganization. If we think about our current state of COVID and having to quarantine and things like that, certainly a crisis. And we've been in this elongated disorganization because we're not sure what recovery is going to look like, and it's been very slow, and this is a profound circumstance. But it's just a great example for people to kind of understand that process. But in a healthy system, or within an individual who's developed very healthy growth mindset skill sets, the disorganization period is commonplace. But then the individual starts to work through the crisis, accessing supports, engaging skill sets they have, and so that the post-crisis reorganization, right, that after recovery level, they're left with a skill set that allows them to be better suited for the next crisis, right? Just learning, neuroplasticity, right? It's physiological as somebody puts together these skill sets. And so it's important to kind of understand when we're talking about resilience and when we're talking about a growth mindset and social emotional learning curriculum, what we're doing is creating adults of the future, right? We're giving young people everything they need to have the capacity to be successful as they engage their environment on their own. And that's, you know, as a parent of a 15-year-old, like that's my job, is to make sure that this person can go out there and be successful in their community. And when they do run into adversity, because they should, like that's part of their life experiences, they have the capacity to manage those things. So again, that's our optimal kind of mindset right there, is having that growth capability in terms of adversity. The next slide really demonstrates the opposite of that, or the reverse of that. When you think of a system, and I use this a lot when we talk about substance use disorders and those systems of family, the disorganization is commonplace. Crises might be occurring more frequently in some systems, but a fixed mindset response allows or doesn't allow the reorganization and stabilization to be really productive. When you're thinking about a fixed mindset response, you're met with individuals who just almost immediately try to circumnavigate the reality of the crisis, right? So it's almost like the serenity prayer, change the things I can. No, I can change the things I can't, right? I'm just going to change the fact that there's a crisis. I'm going to fix that part. And that's not necessarily the most productive strategy for engaging adversity. You know, watching our young people respond to COVID and having the capacity to walk through the obvious grief and loss that comes with some of the developmental circumstances they wouldn't necessarily have, and the kind of those hallmarks of adolescence that they would get to engage in, like proms and things like that. They're worth grieving, absolutely. But on the flip side of that is that they really do have an opportunity to challenge themselves to respond to this crisis and be successful on the other side in spite of the adversity. But again, we saw young people running into this and kind of shutting down. Seeing that wall that has now been put in front of them is insurmountable, not being able to appreciate it as a difficulty and something that they can work through, but rather them trying to change the fact that it's happening. And so when we think about crisis responses and resilience, there's a benefit to it. And I think, again, it's a universal benefit for our young people. So the other thing that I want to talk about is looking at some of the systems that might create that dynamic and the changes that we've made recently in our community to kind of engage those and to work differently than we have been. You can go to the next slide, Kitty. It's coming. Woo! Technology is slow sometimes. So a lot of you who might work in behavioral health or are teachers or educators or substance use prevention, all kinds of different interventions, we really frequently rely on a model that allows us to have conversations and to think about young people so that we can intervene on them in productive manners, right? We have a limited amount of resources, and those resources need to be deployed in very specific manners. Like, I understand all of that, but at the same time, I really think it's helpful to just be aware and challenge some of the systems that our young people are engaging so that we can think about how to make sure that they're not having unintended consequences. And so anybody who's ever been to any kind of educational trainings, right, you always have a triangle kind of coming out, right? It's not a good presentation in public health or education unless the tiered interventions pop out. And so that's the education piece, right? School-wide interventions. When you see systems to support the majority of the population, that's a tier 1 intervention in education. Tier 2 are more targeted, that might be small groups, right? Things like that. And then tier 3 interventions are really, really intensive, right? They're very, very labor intensive. They might involve students being outside of the classroom, have individual supports, things like that. And so again, this becomes a way to talk about education and understanding where a student's at and what we can do. In my world of substance abuse prevention, we use primary prevention, secondary prevention, and tertiary prevention, which is really intervention, right? Same model. The majority of students respond to psychoeducation and things like that. Secondary interventions might involve skill set groups and helping young people really have targeted capabilities that they might need because of genetics or outside systemic issues. And then intervention, where somebody really needs to be in acute care and working with a counselor specific to some struggles. And then the top left one is just evidence-based practice, right? If we were to map out what it looks like, that's evidence-based care, kind of taking the information that we have, clinical experience, patient values, and putting them all together and responding. And again, these are really, really important structures so that we can have conversations about what we're doing in our community. But they're also potentially difficult because they have consequences that I don't think we necessarily think of. And so I think that's important in our overall conversations when we're talking about developing resilience or creating an environment where young people are challenged to develop in a way that they are competent and capable and comfortable out in the real world. And so taking a look at the next slide, we can kind of look at some of those, right? When we think about tiered interventions, when we think about that general tiered overview, I think it's really important to have the caveat that if that's universal precautions, right, if that's universal engagement, one of the things that that tier needs to do is help us reduce the stigma associated with interventions in the other two tiers. And again, that's going to make sense as we continue in this conversation, but kind of think about that as we go. Our systems like that are created to sequester individuals, right? As somebody who grew up really struggling academically, I had some learning disabilities specific to reading. I was consistently put into really well-meaning special groups to allow me to be better suited to engaging what I needed to engage. The unfortunate byproduct of those is that the systems around me assigned value to those groups, right? And so all of a sudden, rather than being a part of, connected with my community, I'm now separated or made to feel a specific way because of my capacity or how I engaged. Nowadays, we're using terms like neurodiverse, which I love the ideals behind changing those conversations and having a different dynamic, because really, when you think about special needs, they're not special, they're just needs, right? They're only special because the system is set up to engage this population more readily than another population, you know, versus big picture schools and things like that that are really designed to allow the celebration of different learning styles. I get to do a lot of stuff with, and I'm pointing because the school's right there. I live in downtown Issaquah. So I get to do a lot of work with Gibson Eck, simply because their model allows for, you know, me to be part of their instruction and working with interns and stuff. And I'm always so excited about the opportunities to be in that building and watching, when we could be in the building, right? When watching the levels of different levels of learning and different learning styles and everything that was created around that model. It's really encouraging to watch people, the students, celebrate each other's capacities to do that stuff. In other systems, unfortunately, it starts to perpetuate a ranking system. And so you're instantly aware of where you fit. And that's not the student's fault, right? We've created something that as a byproduct makes them think about different needs and as less than and better. And I don't know, again, exactly where that lives, but we all kind of know it. I mean, we have organizations in our community that just even use verbiage like elite soccer and just these taglines that put people in different boxes so that we know that their capacity and capabilities are better, not different, but better, right? Elite doesn't inspire a different learning capabilities or styles or capacities. It's really putting stuff into a hierarchy. And so again, when we think about suicidal behaviors and belonging and things that create connection and community, are these the most beneficial methods of kind of doing that in our community? So how can we change some of those ranking systems? Or more importantly, how can we change the associated ranking system for that? I mean, we need measures of capability, right? That's important to know where somebody's at. But how did the other designations get assigned to them, right? When my 15-year-old was really young, and I was doing this work, I would frequently ask them, I was like, hey, who are the best 3 readers in your class? And they could read them off, just eating their macaroni and cheese and go, Bobby, Sue, and Jimmy. I go, who do you think needs the most help? And they could name the 3 or 4 students who needed help, but there was never a hierarchy assigned to it, right? There was never, and so I don't know where that happens. Is that middle school? Is that high school, where all of a sudden we have better than, less than? And so what can we do to change that dynamic to some degree? What can we do to change those? If we think about the culture that we exist in, it really does perpetuate, especially a social media culture, a narrative that's very specific in terms of capacity and capability, right? Like if you go on, I just joke around, like if you go on social media, like if I ever want to be depressed, I can go like jump on Facebook and look at where I'm not, right? Oh, look, here's me not in Hawaii, right? Like it's rare that on social media, Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, there's not a presentation of struggles, right? There's a presentation of accomplishments. And the idea is that everybody has all the capacity they need to accomplish all of these things. And we know that that's not the case, right? As adults, we are aware that things are a struggle, right? I used to love to take pictures of my teenager's door closed. It's like, this is where they just slam the door, in frustration and stuff, because that's real. Those are the real dynamics that we're engaging. And so, how are we allowing young people to understand that they don't have to be perfect? They don't have to live up to this level of expectation that we've created to have an amazing existence in their world and a wonderful life, right? I had the opportunity to attend a presentation that we brought into Issaquah, I think in Sammamish as well, from the folks at Challenge Success, Stanford University program. And the presenter started off the conversation with all these parents and said, so when your child is 25, 26, 27, what do you want their life to look like, right? And they outlined, all these people raised their hand, and we talked about all of this wonderful stuff. None of it had to do with their grade point average. None of it had to do with these designations, physical designations of their capacity to do X, Y, and Z. It was about kindness and compassion and giving and all of this wonderful stuff. And so she asked the question, she's like, so why do we have all of these systems that our students are perpetuating, are participating in, that aren't creating those very things that you want your child to be capable of doing, right? Like, that doesn't make a lot of sense. It was such a poignant moment in the conversation to think, like, what our young people are going through and what is the byproduct on the other side, and is it what we want for them? And for some it might be, and for some of the students it might be. But again, what's generating our overall increases in suicidal behavior in our communities? Like, what's perpetuating that? And how can we change that dynamic? You know, I think it's an important conversation. And lastly, I think, just as a caveat, we've institutionalized a lot of these practices. Again, when you think about the dominant culture, dominant structures, that stuff has become part of the diagrams that we utilize and the policies and procedures we create for our young people. And so we're going to have to work really hard to change some of those, because again, it's common practice. You know, when you think about evidence-based care, in my field as a behavioral health counselor, we use that terminology all the time, evidence-based practices. And I always think, you know, like, that's almost code for dominant culture structures, because the individuals who created all those models are of the dominant culture. It's all based on dominant culture psychology. And so who is it going to, you know, best fit in terms of those models? So is it reaching everybody? Who is it reaching? What dynamics and principles are engaged? Because they have to be. You know, they're, again, part of that structural process. So I think that's an important conversation. So those are all kind of the caveats. When we think about all of that together, what's occurring in our young people's lives, right? What is the byproduct of all those systems? And I think the next graphic really kind of gets to the heart of that. For some individuals, is that we perpetuate a structure or a system that gives people an understanding of what they should be doing. And then the folks who don't fall into those models, unless we change some of those dynamics, really don't feel comfortable. They feel lost, they feel broken, or they're made to feel that way. For those of you who might be local, you might remember that we used to have an alternative school, Tiger Mountain Community High School, that was on the campus where my 15-year-old's middle school was, Issaquah Middle School. And we closed that for a year, and then Gibson Eck was created after that. And anybody who worked in our community for any period of time knew that Tiger Mountain Community High School became almost a dumping ground for individuals who just fell into those two smaller boxes. You know, they were really described as less than, as broken, as lost, and we didn't have a lot of capacity to do much about it. It was hard to change the dynamics and change the structure. I would hear people in our community who never worked with kids, obviously, because we all know that young people are brilliant just the way they are, and they might have some significant struggles and need caring adults around them, encompassing, you know, all of those needs for their success. But folks would refer to kids as Tiger kids. Like, that was like just part of the, you know, the euphemisms in our community. Oh, that's a Tiger kid, you know, like it just encompassed who that kid was. And I just took such offense to that, you know, because they were within structures that didn't understand them, didn't have the capacity to care for them. And so the wonderful people at Tiger did their best to do everything they could for those young people. But it was such a broken system in our community that we had to close it and kind of reorganize. But I always think of that as part of that model is how can we reach a much more diverse population and again, make sure that tier 1 intervention, part of that tier 1 intervention has to be that the next 2 tiers aren't just inundated with the stigma associated with doing it. You know, we have a lot of models like that, and we can change those models. Whole other conversation we can get into, but I think that's important. So again, looking at some solutions, what can we do to look at changes in our community. I like the model put forth by Kenneth Ginsburg. I think it's a really simple model to kind of understand. He talks about the 7 C's, or ingredients of resilience, coming up very soon. It flies across. There we go. So thinking about resilience, I like Dr. Ginsburg's works for a couple different reasons. One is that it's very, very easily digestible, right? I don't like complex things. Dr. Ginsburg is very oriented towards sound engagement and care and compassion and parenting and all these wonderful things. And I'll make some recommendations for some books specific to that. But I think about any model of engaging the development of resilient skills, again, serves as a protective factor for our young people. Again, it's not a substitute for access to mental health care. It's not a substitute for access to acute services. If somebody is struggling, they're experiencing suicidal ideation, they need help immediately, right? Call 911, get services. But when we think about moving way upstream and changing the dynamics or the experiences that young people are having, so that the output on the other side is less demanding on their internal locus of control and everything that comes with that, I think that's a really important discussion to have. And so I also love that the model is founded on those 3 principles: unconditional regard, right? Healthy expectations for young people so that they know what to do and not to do, and caring individuals as role models for those systems. I was super excited when I started to explore Dr. Ginsburg's work. I was super excited about reading his books and watching, videos that he had presented, and I was really digging it. And I went home. I live here, but I went back to where I grew up in Philadelphia to see some of my friends over the summer. And I was really excited to talk to my friend Karen. She is an educator as well, and we always just kind of vibe on young people and engaging youth and changing lives. And so I was super stoked to talk to her about Dr. Ginsburg work. So I get back to Philadelphia, and then we drive down the shore. Yep, just like in the shows and the movies, right? We go down the shore. So we're hanging out down in the New Jersey shore on the beach, and we finally have a minute to start talking about Dr. Ginsburg's work. And I start talking about it. She goes, "Ken, he's our next door neighbor." And I was like, I was such a fanboy. I was like, oh my God, can I talk to him? Can I come over? She kind of ruined all my excitement by being his next door neighbor, but it was a great story for her to kind of share all the cool train rides they took into Center City, and because that's where he was doing his work at the University of Pennsylvania. So wonderful author, and again, I'll share some books about the work that he does, but it's a great model to use when we think about moving upstream and making sure young people have what they need to be successful. The first C, if you will, that Dr. Ginsburg talks about is competence. And so when I think about engaging in resilience work, I think about this from a couple different places. When I think about it as an educator, somebody who works with young people, I also think about it as somebody who works in behavioral health and engages young people in services and care specific to substance use disorders. But lastly, I think about it from a standpoint of being a parent. I think that can be a really profound place to look at how I engage stuff and what do I need to change to meet some of these expectations or think differently about parenting. One of those is the concept of just developing competence when young people are engaging in their environment. As I grew up in the generation where we want our young people to have things that we did not have, right? I mean, that was also true of my parents' generation, but as a single father and having an only child, I have always been of this protective, mindset, right? That I just have this one and I can't break this. Like I have to, and unfortunately, I had to really challenge some of my beliefs about how I was engaging my young person. The other thing, as we've discovered on the call before we started with Nate and Cato, is that I have control issues. And so I really found myself overcompensating and getting my hands into stuff that my young person was doing that I didn't need to, because one of the things that I wasn't allowing them to do was to fall down and get back up. I always wanted to catch them right before they hit the ground, and that wasn't necessarily in their best interest. Obviously, we're not talking about profound falls and profound circumstances where they would really be in harm's way, but just living and learning to fall down, to dust themselves off, to get back up, and to figure out what happened and how they could do things differently. I think that became profound for me when I started to realize that every time that I kept stepping in, and I step in with a lot of stuff, like they'd be in the kitchen wanting to cook something, and I'd just be like, that's not where that goes. That has to be lower. You need to turn that up. There needs to be this. And every time I would do that, I realized what I was saying to my young person is that I don't believe you can do this. And obviously there's always circumstances where they probably shouldn't be doing that, but I really needed to step back and just let them succeed, right? Let them walk through what they needed to walk through. And occasionally it was going to turn out different, right? And not better or worse, but at least they were developing the competence to engage and realize what was involved in the work. And so, yeah, I had to start to change my even how I presented information to my young person. I think I was taught as a parent to, always say how proud I was of my young person, and I still do. But I started to realize, especially working with Dr. Ginsburg's stuff, to like how important it was for them to be proud of themselves. Right? Like that's because I'm not always going to be there. They're going to be with themselves. And so they need to be comfortable with who they are. So changing those dynamics to, you know what, you should be really proud of yourself. You worked really hard on that. It's an important distinction, but one that I kind of had to take to heart. The next C is confidence, and it kind of plays off of the competence. Again, proud of yourself versus proud of, that I'm proud of you, but it's really looking at the effort that was involved in a circumstance and rather than always focusing on the accomplishments, for better or worse. And I will say it here, and I would say it in front of my teenager, but when they were little, not every single painting that they drew was a masterpiece, right? But I love them. I cherish them. They're still hanging in my kitchen, much to his chagrin. He's like, could you take that stuff off the walls now? I'm 15. I'm like, nope, that sunset is mine. But we're used to being in circumstances where we always say, oh my God, you're a wonderful artist, or you're this, or you're that. And what we really are looking to encourage is the effort that they're putting into that, right? Math is not something that most people are just instantly born being capable of doing. And so what young people have to be capable of engaging is effort, right? To have accomplishments. It takes practice. It takes, resilience and grit to work through stuff. So I think looking at the efforts and the qualities that you appreciate in a young person, those are the things that we're qualifying or acknowledging, because that's the stuff that's going to sit with them internally in terms of their locus of control. It's going to give them a sense of well-being that isn't externally created. And then again, the other opportunity that they have, you can advance, Cato, if you can. The other opportunity that they have is to work on value systems. Again, when you think about social emotional learning curriculum that's come about, we're really focused on helping young people, again, to have a system engaged in terms of their compass that allows them to make decisions based on those value systems that they're creating. And so they feel much more confident in their capabilities because they have that internal structure. And again, that allows them to be more productive on the other side. The next C, if you will, is connection. And I think that that has taken somewhat of a beating in terms of our models as well. The connections that we've made have changed dramatically in terms of how people interact. And so, again, getting back to a place where we have social emotional learning curriculum, young people are developing those skills to create emotional ties where they can share information that's even concerning, right? Allowing them to have conversations that might be difficult. A lot of people discount social media, I think, to some degree in terms of relationships for young people. And I'm still on the fence about a lot of that. I think that young people rely on social media just in a different way. Digitally, that's their landscape, and I think that they do have the capacity. That doesn't mean that some kids aren't stuck in very superficial engagements in social media, but it's just one more platform. You know, I don't think we're seeing a lot of people who can't flip between those platforms, although their etiquette sometimes, especially when I get emails from students, you know, is very social media-esque. But I think when you think about connections in our communities, it has changed dramatically. Young people aren't relying on themselves and their peers as much as they might have at one time. And again, being in the pandemic and being sequestered and quarantined, I think has changed a lot too. But a lot of our systems that used to be in place are no longer in place. I think about the capacity for young people to develop conflict resolution skills and the competencies that they need out in their community. We don't have a lot of places for them to do that. It used to be that those things were part of just their general learning. When I was younger, we were out in the community or on the playground, and we were interacting in very non-structured ways. And unfortunately, I think we've gotten to a place where a lot of the interactions that young people have are super structured, and they're monitored by adults to the point where young people don't get the opportunity to figure stuff out. I love the movements that we have specific to restorative justice practices in our schools and communities, where young people actually have to come together when they have difficulties or when somebody needs to make amends, which is a wonderful activity for young people. You know, when you think about it currently, you get suspended, you go away, you come back, everything's done. But nobody actually had to walk through what happened and what occurred, and so it's a different model and a different way to think about stuff. But our playgrounds don't have opportunities for young people to develop those skills anymore. And so it can be problematic, I think, for young people when they run into conflict trying to figure out what to do because they've had other individuals intervening for them in those. The other thing that comes in with connections is staying focused and being mindful in terms of, foster belonging goes with all those, right? A sense of self, a sense of connection. What are we doing in our community to be a part of instead of separated from those? Again, when you think about the Joyner model of suicidal behaviors, we're talking about a disconnect for young people, thwarted belonging, where young people don't feel a sense of connection. And we've got lots of community opportunities for young people to do that. It just doesn't happen. You know, again, our young people are exposed and engaged in a model that really kind of is very individualistic and not very tribal. And so they don't necessarily feel connected to the extent where it might dissuade behaviors that are maladaptive or potentially harmful. Again, sorry. And then the next one is thinking about just mindfulness and being present in terms of your community interactions, which also goes along with belonging and close ties. And again, I'm one of those individuals too who gets really hyper focused on trying to do multiple things at once, and it's an unbelievably difficult thing to try to manage. I think our young people have a big difficulty staying present. And again, we think about suicidal behaviors and rumination and stuff. Being here and now and being okay with where you are and who you are is a really fabulous protective factor when you think about it. Our young people are caught into two different dynamics that are unbelievably stressful. When you think about the most stressful things or places that you can be, it's the past and the future, right? Two realms of existence that you have absolutely no control over, but which you hate potentially and are loathing in terms of what might occur, right? When you look back and something didn't go as you intended, you can certainly sit and be with that for great deals of time and be uncomfortable, or then thinking about stuff that's going to happen in the future. And again, those are unbelievably stressful. When we've had talks about dealing with quarantine and how to kind of find gratitude, that's been part of our conversations, is staying in the here and now, being present, like this presentation, being with your young people, sitting down with somebody that you share emotional ties with, and really listening to them, actively listening to them. All of those things are contrary to our systems for young people, right? School is unbelievably hectic. Our schools are very, very big. It's like a little community. My teenager is at Issaquah High School. I think it's the biggest high school in the area, somewhere around 22, 23, 24, maybe 2,500 kids when it's in session. It's just, that's a very stressful community. And so how can we help them mitigate and kind of be present, right? Not worrying about the next thing and the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, but staying present while they're working on this. Doesn't mean that those things are going anywhere, but helping them to not be hyper focused on two areas of life which they don't have control over as much as the here and now. I think that's important. Moving on from connection, we look at the development of character. And again, thinking about social emotional learning curriculum and helping young people create a really specific vision of who they want to be, or exposing them to all of the things that they might value as a young person, so it guides them as they go forward. I think that can be really, really helpful. So again, supporting spiritual development. And again, that word is difficult. I like to think about spirituality as just value systems. Again, social emotional learning curriculum, kindness, compassion, all of those things that come into play when you think about how are we living as young people? Like, what's important to us? What value systems are driving our work? One of the mechanisms to do that is being of service to other individuals. I can think that model has moved drastically out of the engagements that we have in our community to some degree, and not allowing young people to find, again, purpose. There's probably nothing more spiritual or more fulfilling than being of service to another individual in your community, regardless of what it is, right? But it's so important, and it's such a difficult aspect for the work that we do in our community. I know that schools had community service requirements. So when my ninth grader was in 7th grade, they had community service that they got credit for, right? Think about that for just a second. They had community service that they got credit for. I'm just thinking, that's not community service, that's a job, right? You're being reimbursed for your efforts. And so how do we get young people invested in something grander than themselves, right? Something more important than just what they're doing. I think COVID was a great example of opportunities we had for that, is that young people could stay really uncomfortable with the fact that they're missing out on everything, or find solutions solutions to what they're encountering with their community to be of service to everybody, right? Whether it be sewing masks or getting masks delivered to people or helping with food deliveries and just finding a purpose that really grounds you in community. Again, when you think about our current models of suicidal behavior, those things are amazing protective factors for young people. And I think that they hold a great deal of value. Concepts like empathy and acceptance and inclusion and all of the value system development structures that we can help for young people give them an opportunity to feel differently internally. And again, it's something that I keep coming back to, but our young people are used to being externally evaluated and graded and given indications that they're okay. And instead of developing the locus of control and internal regulation systems that allow them to know that they're okay in spite of what somebody else might say. You know, you think about the idea of bullying, which is a really traumatic event for young people. But how do we also get to a place where our young people are less susceptible to concepts like bullying, right? That they have such an internal structure of comfort with who they are that that those interactions don't impact them to the extent that they do. So again, kind of dividing it and taking the edges and reducing the impact on both sides, because I think that that can be valuable, right? And then again, thinking about helping young people understand what's right and what's easy. And I think our young people, one of the encounters we had with the challenge success and some of the statistics that they shared with us specific to especially highly capable young people who were taking like multiple AB and IB, international backup, AP and IB classes and just having this course load that's not even manageable, is that the young people unfortunately rapidly turn to unhealthy and unethical methods of being successful because they didn't have another alternative, right? It became a circumstance where it was easier to do X, Y, and Z than to go through all of the work that they now felt obligated to engage because of a system that we've created. I don't know how many young people we've had discussions with in our work and workshops on resilience and stuff that I have never in 55 years, well, I haven't been working that long, but I've never had anybody ask me my grade point average, ever, right? There are so many more things that are important to people who you're going to encounter in your world, but our young people don't feel that, right? They feel obligated to do and be within this structure to be successful. Like they see that as the way in and out. And so again, and for some people it's super comfortable and it's not taking or becoming a detriment to them. But I think that there's we're almost overly obligated to that. I remember when we were starting middle school, and they were having orientation and stuff. And remember, in middle school, you have to choose which academic path that you're going to have to take. And they have the highly gifted, capable, whatever, and then just the path. And then I was so struck by, just statistically, a friend of mine went to the orientation and like 95% of the parents were in the highly capable, gifted portion of the show, right? When statistically only about 5 to 10% of the general population fits the criteria for that. So how did that become so skewed and so vital for, your young person's development and capacity and capabilities? And and again, it's not an end all be all. It's just part of the discussion I think that's important to have in terms of what our young people are encountering and how they're getting by, right? Yeah. The next C on the list is contributions. Again, being of service in your community, finding a sense of gratitude, belonging, purpose, you know, and from a time where somebody is super young, they need opportunities to make a difference. One of the coolest things that I had happen as a parent, and I'll take full credit for it, although it has nothing to do with me, is when my now 15-year-old was younger, had to be 4 or 5. We would always go to the Issaquah Farmers Market on Saturdays. It's an awesome farmers market. I can't wait till it opens up fully again. And so we would go and hang out and, you know, eat yummy food and get some stuff to take home. And we were there later in the day one day, and my little one came up and looked at me just inquisitively and said, "Papa," she always called me Papa, "Papa, what do they do with all the food that they don't take back?" And I said, "You know what, that's a great question. I don't know." I said, "I think some people go to other farmers markets and they just, so they can keep the food for a while." And then we asked one of their purveyors, and they said that, you know, if they can't use it and it's not going to travel, they'll just compost it there and stuff like that. And she was just totally caught off guard. You know, she was just kind of like, "Well, wait, so why doesn't somebody take the food to the food bank?" And I thought to myself, because if you could see outside the window over here, I live right across from the Issaquah Food Bank. And I said, "Well, I guess we could take the food to the food bank." And she was like, "That would be a good idea." And so for the next 2 years, every Saturday, we would drive over there with the big double milk crates, and a little 4-year-old with hair all the way down past their butt would go from purveyor to purveyor and collect food to take to the food bank every Saturday afternoon. And it was just an amazing experience to watch that person get exposed to just being of service, like just to be part of the community. And it's kind of funny, we'll go to the farmers market now, and the food bank actually adopted the program later on. They actually have a volunteer now who has a table at the food bank, and you can actually buy stuff there and drop it off, and then the food bank gets that food and the rest of the food. And my young person will walk by and see the table and go, "Oh, that's a pretty cool idea." And she'll like almost wink, right? Because she kind of remembers you know, that she was part of kind of creating that. And it was just such an amazing thing to watch. Again, a young person being of service, because that's just what you should do, right? You're just part of a community. It's just an important attribute for young people. And again, when you think about interpersonal models of suicidal behavior, it's an unbelievable protective factor for folks. So the next of the C's is coping, in terms of looking at coping strategies and how we can demonstrate healthy coping strategies and decision making in our community. And I think I've noticed, and I don't know if you've noticed this just recently with our isolation, a lot of social media posts specific to consumption of alcohol. There's been a couple different articles written about this profound demonstration, unfortunately, for young people, that how you have fun and how you manage stress is specific to alcohol consumption. And again, I can certainly anecdotally think about social media and watching posts in the community as people kind of look to relieve stress, and they're adults, and that's fine. But it's really an interesting phenomenon from a research standpoint to watch and to be able to catalog, because we know consumption rates have gone up for young people. Overdose rates, even in our opiate crisis, have increased. And so our young people are really in need of demonstrations of healthy models of strategies to cope with crisis, adversity, difficulties, stress, things like that. So what are we doing as family members to make that happen, right? Taking a walk, doing yoga, taking a run, walking the dog, art, all of it, right? There's so many ways that we can demonstrate for our young people how to engage crisis and stress in a really productive way. The other thing in terms of coping strategies is embracing a growth mindset. I'm a huge fan of Crowd2X's work in terms of growth mindset, and we'll talk about some very specifics that will be practical application stuff to take with us when we leave. But a growth mindset is such a value because it allows me to stay malleable and not be shut down by difficulties, but respect them and engage them so that I can get to the other side of the difficulties as I go. The other thing that comes along with coping strategies is that if you want your young person to be capable of making healthy decisions, you have to let them make decisions. And not all of them are going to be super healthy and productive, but that's where they're going to be practicing, right? That's how they're going to learn to engage those. So I think that's important. The last C is control. And so when we think about just our overall engagement strategies, helping young people to believe in their abilities, their capacity, showing them that they're valuable, that they have power, because those things are going to play into the healthy coping strategies that they're developing, and they're going to be much more readily comfortable using those as they go. We have created, again, a young adult to go out in the world and be successful by kind of looking at these models. And I think that handing them that capacity and allowing them to make decisions all kind of speaks to that model of engagement and the strategies that we're going to employ, right? Obviously, we're going to let them know that we really care about them, like that they're important, and that I always used when I worked in residential behavioral health, I would create precious cargo contracts when young people were involved in kind of maladaptive patterns of behavior or self-talk or things like that, and really kind of poke at them to understand how important they are as young people and their values, so that they would kind of acknowledge that. So yeah, help them to understand and see that you care, right? That you're not going to let go when things get difficult, that you're always going to be there to walk with them through that stuff, right? So then moving on to the next slide, thinking about, again, practical applications. We can just cruise to there. One more. Thanks, Gator. Thinking about practical application stuff, looking at how we can think and help young people engage differently in terms of the impact that they'll have in the community. And we can just cruise through these, Cato, because it'll be fun. Thinking about differentiating and helping young people differentiating between being proud of yourself and being arrogant. Right? Pride is a very quiet engagement. I think our young people have a significant confusion between the idea of winning and succeeding, right? Again, working at Gibson Eck, I get to watch young people work together to perpetuate each other's successes. And then talking to young people recently that when they're applying to colleges, they're not even communicating with their friends where they're applying because they don't want the competition. Like, success is not a pie, right? Like, success is something that we all have access to, and that's different than the concept of winning. And again, we've created that dynamic to some degree. When you have a dynamic of trying to win, you're always going to have young people who are invested in maladaptive strategies to get there. When we're working with our young people, we're focusing on their engagement. I had a dear friend of mine who I've presented with a couple times. She she grew up in this family that was very oriented towards sports, and that was kind of their gig, and they were big into soccer, and she was an amazing soccer player, right? She was really good. And so her world kind of revolved around that elite sport. But as she got older, she realized that every time, for most things in her world, every time that she would come home, the first question that her parents would ask her is how she did, instead of asking her how she was. And it was a profound revelation for her and for me to think about that concept is, what's really important. Yeah, somebody might have had a test today and we can get to that. But, as somebody that you care about, you're probably more concerned about them as an individual than the grade that they got. So why not start with that, right? How are you versus how did you do? Supporting, again, the process versus the outcomes, because the process is what's going to allow them to be successful later. All right, so that's what we really want. That's what we're looking towards. Thinking about supporting young people to understand that their insides are so much more important than their outsides. Growing up in the era that I did, it was really, especially also being, from a family of blue collar workers, it was really difficult sometimes to not have the support that a young person could need to develop just an internal level of self-worth. So I was always concerned with what people thought about me on the outside. And so we can help our young people change those dynamics, is that it's always going to be an inside job, right? Your insides are going to be much more important to take care of than your outside appearance. And again, social media plays a little bit into that as well, as it's a very visual medium for young people, but I think it's important to kind of stress the insides versus the outside. Teaching the value of a challenge. Our young people run into circumstances where they really believe that they should just kind of walk through to the other side, instead of them understanding that it might be difficult. My young person happens to be pretty apt at most things, especially language arts and stuff like that. And not so much that he can't do math. It's really the amount of effort that's involved in doing math, right? You think about learning an instrument or something like that, it's supposed to be challenging. It's supposed to take effort. And so it's just kind of now become a running joke whenever I say, this is hard. I'm just like, yeah. And he just walk away, because it's supposed to be hard, right? That's why it has value. And so helping to kind of reinvigorate that idea of the challenges are supposed to be inherent to your capacity to feel accomplishments. That's what they should be, right? Help, again, from a growth mindset to change yet, or change can't to yet. It's a huge premise in growth mindset work, is our young people get stuck with the idea that they can't accomplish something, and it's very fatalistic, versus the idea that, yeah, you might not be able to yet. So how can we instill the yet? How can we support that process? And then finally, one of my favorites, because I think it's really lacking in some of the engagements for our young people, is the idea of grace, right? Humility, integrity, things like that, that again are coming from social emotional learning curriculum, but have really been perpetuated for the last 10 or 15 years by a very high stakes testing, standardized testing kind of model in our schools. And I don't think we had a great deal of balance between that and the social emotional learning curriculum that young people need, right? One of my favorite little social media memes or Facebook memes is that, yes, your son might get, A's on all of their, their chemistry tests, but if they don't have the capacity to do something with those in their community, what is it worth? Right? So there needs to be a balance so that young people are finding, again, those internal structures of comfort and and feeling really good about what they're doing out in the community, so that they're not turning. Again, all of this is to support them to engage these kinds of structures versus maladaptive patterns of behavior. Because when people are running into what they're envisioning as insurmountable obstacles, then they're going to look towards mechanisms that aren't necessarily healthy and productive. And we want to change that dynamic, right? So resilience is simply the capacity to bend and to be comfortable in that, and not break as a result of the encounters that you're having out in your community. And it allows you to kind of be successful. Like I said, some fall readings for you. 2 books by Dr. Ginsburg that you can throw on your Amazon list. You can certainly get them used, so they're not super pricey, but I would definitely suggest these 2 to start. And I think the Sammamish Y actually might be starting a book club, and these could potentially be part of that, but we'll have to wait and see. I'm not sure if those things are all set, but if they are, how cool would that? A little plug for the Sammamish Y. Yeah, and so let's end there, and we got some time for some questions possibly. We can flip over and go from there. And you can definitely leave that up. That's one of my favorite quotes from The Tale of Despereaux.
Yeah, that is awesome. Thanks, Jerry, so much for taking us a little maybe further upstream in the conversations that we've been having over the last couple of weeks, which have been focused maybe a little bit more in maybe the immediate. And so appreciate the learnings about what we can do to even get to that space. So appreciate all your knowledge and a lot of information and good stuff in, just barely over an hour. So, but to your point, we have maybe about 10 minutes. So we'll do a handful of questions that have sort of popped through the chat here. So let me pull out a couple. How about this one? How do people get involved in supporting youth and adolescents in the community? What's maybe like a quick, easy way for someone to say, I just need to dip my toe. Where can I start? Jared, it looks like you might still be on mute. I don't know if you did that in between.
I didn't, but am I unmuted now?
No, you're good now. Yep, we might have done that to you.
Lots of our organizations, Influence of Choice, the YMCA have advisory boards where you can be part of creating curriculum and engagement in the community. There's lots of organizations that have boards. That's a great way to get involved. There's lots of organizations that are looking for volunteer opportunities. The Voice Mentor Program with the Issaquah Schools Foundation, like Washington Schools Foundation, has lots of opportunities as well for folks to engage in some of the programming they have. And so I think that would be a great place to start. If you're looking for something specific to substance abuse and mental health promotion, reach out to me and I'll find something for you. Absolutely.
Absolutely. There's never not a need for more committed volunteers who want to get engaged. This one I think is really interesting, so I'd love to get your feedback on. When we change the words such as special, does it really change the stigma in the general population, as it seems that lots of words change, yet the stigma remains? What's the scientific evidence around word changing stigma among a larger population base?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Unbelievably insightful. I think it really has to have direction behind it. We change verbiage consistently in our communities, but then we do the same exact thing and then wonder why those belief systems don't change. And so I really believe that the verbiage needs to also change, but so does how we're engaging people. I'll give you an example, and this is not meant to disparage the programs that do this, because I'm part of doing this as well. But you think about our Power Pack programs and our programs to provide supplemental food for young people. You think about how we deliver those. There's these almost stealth systems where a kid will, a bunch of kids will come into their counselor's office on a Friday afternoon. They'll roll in quietly, they'll stuff something in their backpack, zip it up, and they'll head out the other door to jump on the bus so nobody knows that they needed it. Think about that for a couple minutes. We've just created a system so that that young person feels absolutely shameful that they need something that other kids don't need in our world. Like, it baffles me, but I don't know what to do about that, right? I don't know how we change such a gigantic belief system around the ideas of need. But you're right, just changing the words doesn't change how we engage young people in understanding it as all equitable, and those dynamics are big. Again, they're systemic, So thinking about different ways that we engage our elementary age folks to understand disparity and to not see it as less than and better than, but just part of somebody's experience as a person. And so everything then fits into that a little better, but it's really hard. You're absolutely right. We've created kind of these models to protect young people from the public, but by creating them, the public doesn't understand their dilemma as normal, so they're seen as less than. Like, you don't go to the food bank over here and stand in line and have people not kind of go, oh, that's a shame, versus, oh, they just need something right now, right? It's just a different mindset. But if you have any ideas on how we can do it, I would love to continue those conversations. We've been having lots of them about that. It's difficult.
Yeah, I mean, talk about a challenging thing to shift in the public kind of discourse. It's not exactly a easy or straightforward process. This one's especially relevant due to the nature of our schooling. Since all the curriculum has gone online at the moment, are there any courses or online classes or videos that you would recommend for middle schoolers or high schoolers pertaining to their own social emotional learning that they might be able to share with, their young one or others?
I think I would acquiesce to the school curriculum because it's designed to help them. Every student should have social emotional learning curriculum as part of their work. I know the Issaquah School District uses a specific program and the Lake Washington School District uses a specific program. My wife is a teacher in that school district, and so I know that they're engaging that on a daily basis. It's now part of the curriculum. So there's like a class. And so I would look at whatever learning system you're using for that. We use Canvas, and you can look at all of the different modules specific to social emotional learning and see where they're at and what they're engaged in. And then Brene Brown stuff, is wonderful in terms of looking at empathy and thinking about your local libraries and what stories really are germane to the ideas of compassion and connection. And there's just so many wonderful stories that unfortunately, have been kind of put on the back burners for more kind of racy, engaged kind of youth appeal. And I think that there are a lot of really good books that young people could be accessing. I would encourage you to reach out to your teen librarians. Jessica is ours in Issaquah. Brooke is the teen librarian up in Sammamish, if a lot of people are from those areas. And they'd be a great resource and would love to give you a list of both elementary and secondary books that might be engaging in terms of those skill developments, because you're right, you can never have enough social emotional learning, right? I could use it and I'm 55, so, right.
Yeah, I don't think that skill ends when you graduate high school. It's something that's a lifelong learning opportunity, right?
Yeah.
So we only have about 2 minutes left here. So how about you, if you maybe take 60 seconds or so, and just last kind of notes to share with anyone. If someone's saying, okay, I learned a lot, but what's the first thing I should really focus on? Or just anything else you kind of want to share in the last minute or so.
Oh, sure, absolutely. In all the work that we do, especially engaging families, is really setting aside time to have these important conversations, helping your young people have conversations that are meaningful and robust on a consistent basis so that when things do get difficult, you can do that. My young person is unbelievably stoic in terms of sharing information and emotions and stuff like that. It's something that's always been part of their DNA, and so it's like pulling teeth. But having a space, having conversations on a consistent basis, setting expectations, letting young people know what to do when they're uncomfortable, where they can turn, knowing what their peer supports are, and then accessing professional help when needed, right? There is a limit to what we can do, and especially when we move from our conversations today about upstream prevention-based work to interventions. We really need to be aware. Like, if you are concerned about your young person, you're probably right, right? Like, if your parent spider senses are kind of going off, then take advantage of that, because it's an amazing skill as a parent to kind of sense that something's not okay and then act on that. The worst thing could possibly be is that you're wrong, and so get help. Use the supports that you have. All of our schools have access to on-site counselors. Issaquah School District, we have the Swedish counselors. YES counselors are in the Lake Washington School District. Ask advice. Don't be alone. Again, reducing the stigma associated with behavioral health struggles is super important, but it takes us to act in that manner. Is that this isn't a function of parenting skills. It's not a function of being bad and good. It's a function of needing something specific to your current circumstance, and you deserve to get all of the help that you need to be successful. Our young people deserve everything they need to develop in a manner that allows them to be successful as young adults and as folks in our community who are going to take up this charge, right? They're going to be the next generation of folks who are caring for individuals. So it's important.
Awesome. Thank you for those words. I do really appreciate you coming on today and spending an hour and a half with us, sharing your knowledge and expertise. And thank you for the work that Influence the Choice is doing in our community. It's important things. And I know that I learned some things today listening to the conversation, and I'm sure those who are also on the webinar picked up plenty of new knowledge as well. So you can also go to the Seattle YMCA's Social Impact Center website to learn more about other opportunities in terms of supports and resources that are available to you. And if you want to support the work that we're doing, you can also find out information about what's available there. As just a reminder, on Wednesday at 6 o'clock, we'll be doing our final webinar session, which is really going to just be mainly a Q&A session where we're taking all the questions that we didn't really get a chance to answer and bringing them back for a conversation. So I hope everyone had a good time listening to Jerry's presentation and learned a bunch of different things, and have a good rest of your Monday. Well, hopefully I'll see you on Wednesday evening.